Κύριε Στόουξ, για την πολύ ωραία και ενδιαφέρουσα συζήτηση που είχαμε. Προχωράμε με μια εξαιρετική ενότητα, όπου θα έχουμε εκπροσώπους από διάφορα think tanks, από διάφορα continents, να συζητήσουμε για τι άλλο, για τις γεωπολιτικές εξελίξεις, για το τι έρχεται. Θα ήθελα λοιπόν να καλέσω εδώ τον κύριο Ντόκο, την κυρία Gavouneli, τον κύριο Wakefield, καθώς διαδικτυακά θα έχουμε την κυρία Elizabeth Sidiropoulos και φυσικά την κυρία Hsiu An Hsiao, να πάρουν τις θέσεις τους. Συντονιστής είναι ο κύριος Φάνης Παπαθανασίου. Ευχαριστώ κύριε Παπαθανασίου. The floor is yours.
Πολύ, Ηλία. Okay. Are we ready? Okay. Welcome to our session. Our session is a very interesting one, a trans-continental discussion on global geopolitical developments. My name is Fanis Papathanasiou. I'm working with the ERT, the Public Television of Greece. It's a real trans-continental discussion, since we have guests and panelists from all over the world. These days, everybody's wondering what changes we'll have with President Trump, what Trump will do in different issues. The whole planet is watching closely to see what major changes will arise under President Donald Trump. Today, we will explore what we can expect in global politics, the immediate and long-term impacts. We will examine how the U.S. priorities regarding trade and tariffs may specifically affect Europe and China. And we will see if Donald Trump is really predictable or quite unpredictable. As I said before, our panelist is a real trans-continental. In addition to our excellent speakers from Athens, Thanos Dokos and Maria Gavouneli, we have people from South Africa, virtually, online. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos is with us. We have Mr. Bryce Wakefield from South Africa. From Australia, sorry. And Hsiu An Hsiao from Taiwan. Everybody is here. Let me introduce them. Mr. Thanos Dokos is a National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Greece. Welcome, Mr. Dokos.
Thank you.
I'm glad to have you here. Ms. Maria Gavouneli is Director General of ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European and Policy Issue, Professor of International Law at the University of Athens. Thank you, Maria, for being with us. Bryce Wakefield, Chief Executive Officer at Australian Institute for International Affairs. Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you.
It's your first time in Greece. I hope you enjoy it. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos is the Chief Executive at the South Africa Institute of International Affairs. She's joining us from Johannesburg. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. And Hsiu An Hsiao, she's Associate Research Fellow of the Institute of International Relations at National Chengchi University in Taipei. Thank you, from Taiwan. So the format is as follows. I will ask our panelists to start with an opening statement, which will cover an initial statement, what immediate and long-term changes we can expect in the world order and international relations as a result of the Trump administration. And then we will follow with questions. So, Mr. Dokos, I want you to start first with the 2-minute, if you can, initial statement.
Good. So, first of all, many thanks to the organizers for the invitation to this very unique panel. I will try to answer wearing both hats, my old think tank hat and my government official hat. And I have 10 bullets, which I promise to cover in a sentence each. And this is more about trends which have been visible before the Trump administration and may or may not be accelerated by the second Trump administration. And first of all, international rules-based order, it will either survive, collapse, or evolve and adapt. And the jury is still open. Second point, a transformation of the concept of the West, including the future of the Trans-Atlantic Alliance. Now, I guess the question now is, could it collapse with a bang, and a whisper, or perhaps a tweet? Point number three, the emergence of the Global South, the continuing and loud emergence of the Global South, which we don't fully understand yet, the dynamics, because it's work in progress. But it's very visible in international affairs, and I should say that Africa keeps emerging, and it's perhaps a sign of the times that I had this morning a long phone call with the first one, with my South African counterparts. Number four, is at last the European Union ready for geopolitical adulthood? And here my hope is that the EU will move ahead with greater European strategic autonomy, fully compatible with a strong NATO. And my fear is that every European leader, starting with those of the big EU member states, will go to Washington and negotiate separately with the new American administration. Number five is the question of how to avoid the fate of the dinosaurs. Because of strong geopolitical competition between the great powers, there's limited space for dealing with global threats, climate change, artificial intelligence, and other transforming technologies, or the management of the global commons. Number six, the changing nature of conflict, now with the emergence of hybrid wars, and we're not fully prepared for that. And greater resilience will be a key objective for all of us, I guess, in the years to come. Number seven, crisis of democracy, and I will let Maria Gavouneli, who's much of an expert on this, to talk about this trend. Number eight, we may see trade wars or tariff wars, whatever you want to call it, but there's also another paradox. After COVID-19, we started talking about globalization and friend sourcing. At the same time, there are great initiatives about more connectivity, gigantic projects like BRI or IMEC. Number nine, the Middle East will be transformed, but how exactly, I think it's too early to tell. But I think the next few years will change that region in fundamental ways. And the last one, the relationship between Europe and Russia. Now, perhaps the probability of a new Cold War has declined slightly, but again, there's so much and so deep mistrust between the Europeans and the Russians, especially on the eastern part of the continent, the Baltics and many of the Eastern Europeans. How we can rebuild some kind of working relationship with Russia will be quite a challenge. So let me start.
Thank you, Mr. Dokos. Very good food for thought. Maria, what the immediate and long-term changes?
Well, let me start where Thanos Dokos finished, because really the 10 points that he raised, and they're all very keen pointers to the future, are actually also indicators for a shift in paradigm that we're actually witnessing. The way we have created our international community after the Second World War, I think has reached its useful life. It has provided us with peace and security and prosperity for 3 generations. It has helped us enormously. We have benefited from it. But I think the time is nigh. We can understand now that we are now moving into a new set of rules, of facts. I don't know what exactly. We are too close to the situation that is developing to understand which particular way it goes, but there's no question that it goes into a different era. There are some characteristics of that different era that we can see or sense, perhaps, at this stage. It is fairly clear that this vertical understanding of the world, two blocks during the Cold War, or separate blocks between Russia and the West, the global South, or whatever else, is not there anymore. Instead, we see subtle differences, if you like, the idea of blocks that are actually defined horizontally rather than vertically. In other words, you would have security from the West, but you would have economic and trade relations with China. You can abide by the axis of the illiberal democracies on the one side, and yet have your market concerns within a certain liberal democracy market. We don't know exactly how this is going to work, but clearly it's going towards a multipolar world. Mm-hmm. Whether these multiple poles would actually be of the same category, of the same power, nobody knows. Whether we are going to have a more decentralized system altogether, or whether it would be a kind of regional groupings that would end up being powerful in themselves, that is another question. And even that definition of regional needs to be revisited, because regional might be somebody who abides by the same rules, if you like, or has the same perspective in the world. So it might not be actually neighbor. So all in all, to finish, I would suggest that at least this first period, certainly the year 2025 would be a year in transition, where we try to figure out what would be the impact of the new presidency, how things are going to develop in Ukraine and the Middle East, what is going on with the Global South, how we are going to review questions of artificial intelligence and the use of technology in our world, how we are going to see the concentration of power to the hands of the few, which is a major, major challenge to our democracy. Democracy is now a distinct minority in the world, and we are challenged in any number of ways. We have been among the winners of the current situation of the way of the world up to now, and we have one major task: how we are going to continue benefiting from the new world that is coming up, and we don't know how it's going to be as yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Let's hear Bryce's perspective on potential changes. Bryce.
Okay, great. I'll try and keep my comments. I agree, of course, that we are shifting to orders that we don't know the shape of to come. But I think I'll try and focus my comments on what this insecurity that we've been talking about all day today, what it means particularly for allies. And I think it's clear that we don't know how Trump will react to particular questions of international affairs. And I say that with full authority, I guess, because we know that his former national security advisor, John Bolton, has said you can never predict what Trump is going to do because he doesn't know himself. He often makes sort of decisions about foreign affairs based on the moment. And that actually contains with it a certain good news story to an extent. It means that he is actually quite suggestible, and it means that certain allies in particular can mold and shape the way that he thinks about foreign affairs. And we have seen this. We saw this in the first Trump administration, in particular with Japan. Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan, was very effective at molding Trump's perceptions on the outside world, to the extent that the national security and other strategies that the Trump administration adopted were basically a Xerox of what Japan had produced, the Indo-Pacific strategy and what have you. So there are countries that can influence Trump. I would argue that possibly Australia, my country, is one of them, and it does have a lot to say to the Trump administration in particular, because we have adopted a strategy based around the purchase of American submarines. It's a very costly strategy. It's going to cost us something in the order of $360 billion all up. And what that means is that that's kind of a method of discussion with the Trump administration. It's likely that, I mean, there are some people in Australia who are quite fearful about what it means for the future of this strategy. But what it probably means actually is that Trump is going to pose Australia as a sort of model citizen, the type of country that is importing arms from the United States, because part of this, of course, is that we're going to purchase American nuclear submarines. Bad news for Europe there, I think, because we're going to be held up as a model citizen against which Europe will have to perform. And I think this story has been told already several times throughout the conference, is that there's going to be an increasing amount of pressure on Europe to raise its military spending. Now, some countries, of course, in Europe like this. But the notion of influence and who gets to talk to Trump is quite a difficult question in the context of Europe. Of course, Ursula von der Leyen is the nominal head of Europe, if you like, the obvious contact point for a discussion. But I can't imagine that she will have much influence on the Trump administration. And I think a lot of the conversations that Trump are going to have with European figures about the EU, US or European-US relationship are going to be with people like Geert Wilders and Viktor Orban. And that, to me, does not tell a happy story about US-EU relations. Thanks.
Thank you, Bryce. We're going to go to Johannesburg now to hear from Elizabeth Sidiropoulos and her initial statement. Elizabeth?
Yes, good afternoon from Johannesburg, and sorry I could not be there in person. Perhaps to start by picking up where Bryce left off, to say that South Africa is probably not a model citizen when it comes to certain people in the incoming Trump administration for a number of reasons which we can go into. I think it would be fair to say that the challenges to the liberal international order are not just of Trump's making or of recent provenance. I think there has been a trend, as Thanos Dokos presented at the beginning, over a number of years, where we've seen many of the issues that are manifesting themselves now much more strongly. They have been there, whether we see it in the WTO, whether we see it in the UN and the UN Security Council. I think the high water mark of the liberal international order was probably, the first decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and from there things have become much more difficult. I think let me make a couple of observations related to the global South, since I'm at least politically the only person from the South on the panel this afternoon, albeit with Greek extraction. And the first point to make is clearly that countries like South Africa and others in the global South believe in a rules-based order. We see that rules-based order as critical to ensure that the mighty don't do what they like and the weak have to suffer. We also believe in a multipolar world order, that a more multipolar world would serve the interests of the developing world. I think that's probably a double-edged sword, and that there are challenges to a world where there is a multipolarity, and some of those challenges relate to how multilateralism plays itself out. But looking specifically at the liberal international order, I think it would be fair to say that if you were to ask many people in developing economies, not least on the African continent, you would probably find that while the concept of a level playing field, which is what a rules-based international order is supposed to provide, is a noble objective, the fact is that it has been implemented often in the breach, and that many of the rules and regulations and the governance requires a serious revamp. And I think that was also a point that Maria Gavouneli made, that this is a system that is showing its age, and that therefore there needs to be some real substantive progress in making those reforms, not sort of playing with them at the edges, where I think a lot of effort is placed, but actually real substantial reforms. And Trump in the White House from next year onwards, I think will make that much more challenging. In South Africa at the moment, this is very much part of the conversation because, as you probably are aware, literally yesterday, South Africa took over the chair of the G20. The incoming chair after South Africa in 2026 is going to be the US. And so we're going to have to manage a G20 aiming for some significant outcomes, but really trying to ensure that we keep everybody together and that at the end of the day, there is going to be an outcome that everybody can sign on to, whether it relates to international financial architecture or climate change and climate finance, or on issues related to taxation and illicit financial flows. This will be a challenge, but the flip side of it, and this is where I think a Trump administration is going to be really, really negative, is the more there is significant resistance to change, the more global South countries, particularly as their agency grows, will explore alternatives. And we've already seen that probably in the last decade and a half with the BRICS, and specifically here, the development of particularly the new development bank, the contingent reserve arrangement as part of the BRICS, and exploring also now how to trade in local currencies to counter the impact of sanctions driven by the US.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Very interesting points. And we'll come back here in Athens to listen Anne's Hsiu An Hsiao initial statement. Anne, please.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's the first time I'm in Greece, too. And I like to say for a long time that the Hellenic Republic is one of the countries like Taiwan who have different official names to their commonly known name. So our official name is Republic of China, and shorthand is Taiwan. So thank you for having me here. I'd like to build on my colleagues here to say that, yes, we will be facing a period of uncertainty in the East Asia or the Asia Pacific, where I come from. And I think it's because the changes have actually already been taking place, even during the last 10 years, even from the first Trump administration. And if I look back to what Trump had done in the between 2016 and 2018, before the trade war even started, Trump introduced an increase of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. It also authorized arms sales, more arms sales to Taiwan. It introduced a legislation that potentially upgrading the possibility between officials from the United States to visit Taiwan. So even at that time, he had already done a few things that broke out the box of many of the restrictions. So, but the second Trump administration, I believe, is going to be different from the environment that Trump 1.0 will be in. So I think that for the countries in the region, for the immediate future, we are all bracing for changes, potential changes, and making sense of what those changes can be. So as I understand, many of our fellow countries in the Asia Pacific have been traveling to US, trying to connect anyone who might know Trump or anyone, any of his close advisors in order to make sense what could come in the second administration. And one of the things that came out, if we see the cabinets that have been nominated so far, there are some characteristics. The first batch, the people who control the national security and who will be in charge of the State Department are quite anti-China and quite friendly to Taiwan, quite supportive to Taiwan. These two things, I believe, could be not entirely in line at times. But at the moment, it looks like Trump have his card laid out, and Taiwan is both the bottom line for China, the first red line that cannot be crossed with the US, and so is US putting to say, we are, ready to confront you, and this is what I have. So I think Trump is also putting out his card. So that's the first thing that we are seeing in this transitional period. But there is also the risk of that it provides a window of opportunity for China to continue its more friendly and sort of development-oriented possibilities and strategies towards the region, because the composition of the ASEAN countries are mostly developing countries or small, medium countries. And in Asia, apart from China, most countries are medium or small countries. So the most concerned in this region at the moment will be economic prosperity, social stability, and domestic sort of political sort of cohesion and stabilities. And this, how to balance with the continuing potential competition between the great powers will become more complicated. The calculus and the calculation will become more complicated. So I will stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Anne. Now we'll try to fill in the puzzle. We will start focusing, Maria, with trade and tariffs. Scott Bessent is the choice of President-elect Donald Trump for the Treasury Department. He supports using tariffs to protect U.S. industries and also to use tariffs as a tool on foreign policy. How do you think these trade strategies will be used with Europe and China?
I think that the president-elect and his team have already indicated that they would like to raise tariffs. How did he put it? My favorite word is tariffs, or something like that. But then again, I read just yesterday his latest statement on BRICS, and the idea was that if BRICS were dare to suggest a move away from dollar, he's going to slap them with 100% tariffs. Well, okay, but you know what? If you have a rule, if you have a tool like tariffs, you need to use that tool with moderation. You cannot wave it around just like that, because it would end up being counterproductive at the end of the day. Tariffs as they are, as we expect them to be raised, would have repercussions. Europe, the European Union, is going to respond. It has been made very, very clear. We're not going to take that sitting down and just suffering through that. On the other hand, suffering is going to happen on the American side as well. The moment you have tariffs all over the place, in essence, you close your market. And that just rises prices. And already we've heard that one of the reasons that Trump was elected was really the rise in prices and inflation. I don't see how raising tariffs would actually lower prices. So it could be extremely counterproductive. It's always encouraging to have somebody who knows the market at hand, especially at a proper ministry. Some of the selections announced by the president-elect are not the wisest possible. And I was amused to actually hear the former security advisor Bolton urging Congress not to nominate several of those and not to approve the nomination of several among them. So we'll see. But I would say that we need a certain degree of restraint. Thank you.
Bruce, what's your take on this? And also, how will Australia and other countries in the region try to handle their relationship with the United States and China, especially with Trump's proposal tariffs on imports?
Yeah, look, that's a question that we've been asking ourselves for decades, not just, or for the last decade, not just in relation to the election of President Trump, is how to walk this tightrope, right? How to manage a relationship with China on whom our prosperity depends, while at the same time to satisfy our ally, the United States, on whom our security depends. And it's actually not been that difficult, or it hasn't been as difficult as it's going to be up until now. I think going forward, there are going to be a lot more demands on us from the United States, and the United States can demand quite a lot from us, actually. And the challenge is going to be, if we accept those demands, if we concede to the United States, how to do so without angering China. And that's a debate that we're going to have going forward. In terms of the tariffs, I agree with everything that's just been said there. I mean, tariffs are inherently inflationary, and how do you square that with a US populace who has just voted Trump in on a series of economic promises, including lower prices? Yeah.
Elizabeth, let's go to Elizabeth. How do you think Trump's policies against China will affect South Africa's economy and trade?
So we haven't been specifically mentioned in terms of tariffs, but the discussion around trade, of course, with South Africa, but also more broadly with the continent, is one that has been an important conversation in Washington, D.C. over the last year. First point to make is that, of course, the U.S. is an important trading partner. It's not our largest trading partner. It's the third largest. China is the largest if you disaggregate the EU into its component parts. But of course, the European Union is by far our most important trading partner, investment partner, and the US also in terms of investment. The big discussion in South Africa and concerns about how Washington more broadly, because this has to go to Congress, might respond, is with the renewal of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a unilateral trade measure which was introduced during the Bush administration, Bush Jr. in the early 2000s, Congress, on African matters more generally, Congress has been largely bipartisan over many years, and very much on the issue of AGOA, I think the sense is that it will probably be renewed in the new year for the continent as a whole. South Africa does pose a couple of challenges, I think, to a number of US Congress members, and that is, in the first instance, the position it has taken, particularly on Gaza and Israel. It's also the fact that there are particular state-related interests to what South Africa exports and the competition that creates for US states, in particular members of Congress. And so for some time now, there has been a conversation about whether South Africa will be allowed to continue with a number of exemptions via AGOA, including, for example, our auto sector, which is where we export a number of vehicles to the US. But throwing all that together, there is uncertainty, because South Africa also is not a low-income or just a basic middle-income country, and there is a sense that it should probably be removed. What is an issue that certainly the South African officials over the course of the last year have sought to reiterate is that the AGOA benefits that South Africa is eligible for are not just impacting South Africa if they were to be removed, but they are impacting the entire regional value chain. So our automotive sector is not one that only sources equipment, spare parts, etc., from within South Africa, but it is linked to Botswana, to Namibia, to Eswatini, to Lesotho, and so on, and that has to be factored in any consideration around excluding it from AGOA. Of course, more generally, the issue of tariffs and how they may affect also the Chinese economy have an impact on all of us, because for all of us, I think China is, if not the single largest trading partner, a very important economic player. And so the issue of inflation and costs related to sourcing of inputs and so on are bound to have a global impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Elizabeth. Anne, give us your perspective in regard to the relationship between the United States and China, and how this relationship will affect Europe.
I think, thank you for the question. I think some people are worried that in Trump's second term, he will probably withdraw some of U.S. resources out of Europe and then concentrate its competition with China, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Mm-hmm. So that's the main concern. And then we are seeing a proposal that's being being speculated on Ukraine, and there is potential that Ukraine might be forced into a negotiation, so as Russia to this negotiating table that will compromise Ukraine's interests, sovereignty and its interest. I think these are concerns that is also something which is uncertain But the thing is that I think we still have to wait and see, because as I said earlier, the second term, I do not see the world stay the same as it was a few years ago, which means that Trump's initiation of this tax is not only targeting on hostile countries or rival countries, they are also targeting on some allies and friendly countries. So and the reaction, the initial reaction, as we heard just now from Mexico, is something, and now Russia, China, Mexico, and Canada are all saying, hey, tariff is not a good thing, and it's harmful. So I think that we have to see that, I feel that in Indo-Pacific regions, Asia-Pacific actually has not been so close as for a long time as they are now. Europe and the interest in Europe should be looked together as a package in Indo-Pacific, because it's part of the Indo-Pacific, sort of on the margin of Indo-Pacific. And EU is looking closely into Indo-Pacific. So the stakes are actually, we are in a more intertwined age that you cannot separate these two regions strictly, I think. So even as Taiwan, they were facing considerable threats from on a daily basis from China, and they are closing in on all fronts on Taiwan. Taiwan still goes out, and we go out not just to our diplomatic allies, we go out to Europe. Our foreign minister just came to Lithuania, and we have the TSMC company has just finished their one of their factories in Germany, and another one in Japan, and another one in US, and probably Czech is the next one. So this is the innovative way that the countries like Taiwan, despite its risks and despite its threats, are looking into how to connect more to the world and to kind of create, to provide more public goods together. So one of the main concerns, and I'm sure our colleagues can chip in, is about the security assurance that the US offered in the past to the Asia-Pacific countries. And that is in some way still an expectation from local countries in the region, but they are in doubt about the US assurance and their commitment to the Indo-Pacific region. So.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Bryce will come to Bryce after, and him will mention this topic. But before that, we will go to Mr. Dokos. The United States and Europe will have a lot of issues in the agenda: defense spending, tariffs, Ukraine. So, how Europe will respond to these changes? United or divided? And can Europe create its own strategy regarding Trump and the United States?
Well, first of all, about NATO, which is our primary defense organization in Europe. NATO is in good shape because it has two new members, Sweden and Finland, and both are important contributors. And almost everybody has been spending more on defense. Not quite enough, but more on defense over the last few years. And even now with Trump, even the free riders, which surprisingly include France, Germany, and Italy, they all spend below 2%. And 2% was yesterday's norm. Now we'll start talking about 3%, 3.5% perhaps. So NATO is in a good shape. And the US is not going to leave the alliance. That's very unlikely. But of course, an alliance is about capabilities, but also credibility. So next time there's a tweet saying Article 5 doesn't apply to members who haven't paid their membership fees, that's going to cause a serious problem to NATO's credibility. Now, the Europeans. Back in 2014, first phase of the Ukraine conflict, Brussels said, we got the message. 2022, Russian invasion, Brussels said, we got the message. 2024, they said the same thing. And I think they got some message because things have been done in the defense and security sector over the past 10 years. Past 10 years have been a spectacular change to the almost nothing the EU used to do on defense and security. But the big question now is the one you asked. Now, are we ready to take the next step? Are we ready to spend not only more money, but spend them more efficiently, and also take the necessary steps for increasing European strategic autonomy, which are, in a nutshell, further consolidation of defense industries, flagship projects with common European funding, treating defense as a European public good, and launch 2 or 3 flagship projects which would send a strong message to all directions. One of them could be air defense, another could be cyber, and so on and so forth. And also, it doesn't make sense for a power like Europe not to have a permanent maritime presence in areas of interest. What the Greece, with only a handful of allies, is doing in Operation Aspides, protecting maritime security for the benefit of whole of Europe. And look at the countries sending ships. It's Greece, Italy, Germany. The Dutch send a support ship for a while, and that's all. So it's disappointing. And finally, I mean, at least next time we need to evacuate EU nationals from a place like Sudan, let's do that in a more orderly fashion. So there are things the EU needs to do. But then, assuming the money is not a problem, which it is, because you have many European economies in recession, and if there's a tariff war, things will get worse. But assuming money is not a problem, we do have a deficit of leadership in the big EU countries. And then to ask the second leg of your question, now, in the first Trump administration, Chancellor Merkel tried to act in a way that represented the interests of the EU. She only, partly succeeded. Now, my fear is that even if we have, after the German elections, we have something resembling a strong European leadership, my concern is that, everybody will pay lip service to those common positions and then will go to Washington and try to get a better deal for their own countries.
So, Bryce, it seems like Trump's philosophy, strategy, B2B, business to business, will occur in the next years. Do you think that under Trump we will see more smaller groups like the Quad, the AIIA, while a larger group like the European Union and NATO struggle?
Look, I think we've already seen the proliferation of such groups like Quad and AUKUS, etc. And I think they're fundamentally different, by the way. I mean, the Quad seems to me primarily about keeping India in our team, if you like, because India tends to be particularly promiscuous. And the reason I say this is because if you remove India from the Quad, you've actually got a fairly well-functioning pre-existing trilateral, formal trilateral arrangement between Japan, the United States, and Australia. But you can't really remove any of the other members and say exactly the same thing. I do want to come back to something that Anne has said, however, about how nations of the region are growing more and more close in this current tense environment. I'm not actually sure that I would agree with that. I think from our perspective in Australia, a lot of the countries that we have to influence and have to bring on our side in the South Pacific and in Southeast Asia, there is actually strategic competition going on in these regions for their hearts and their minds, and importantly, their wallets. And in this respect, I think the US has completely dropped the ball. It has taken itself out of the primary trade relationship in Southeast Asia or around Southeast Asia, and that's the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's tried to come back with something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which really means nothing because it doesn't grant these countries access to the American markets. So there is a lack of leadership, particularly in Southeast Asia. The United States has been making noises under the Biden administration about playing a role in the South Pacific, but I think Trump will actually just ignore that, frankly. I don't think he cares about smaller South Pacific countries. But I will say this, Europe is no better in this equation. Europe's approaches to Southeast Asia and countries like Australia have been pretty anemic. Europe cannot even get a free trade agreement signed with Australia. And one of the reasons, or a couple of the reasons it can't, is because of the protectionist impulses of some aspects of Europe that we have been talking about in light of the Trump administration in America. Those exist in Europe too. And also because Europe has standards which are fabricated in Brussels for a European population, and it tries to export those out to other countries. And if you look at the way that the British negotiated their free trade agreement with Australia, it's significantly different. I think, frankly, Boris Johnson gave away too much in terms of access to the British market, but that's a different story. The way that the British approached standards is that they said, okay, Australia, we recognize that you have signed up to a number of international agreements regarding the environment. If you step away from those, or if you backslide on those, then we're going to have to reconsider our way of dealing with you on trade. And that's the way to do it. I don't think that enforcing standards that are made in Brussels for a European population on the rest of the world is particularly smart trade negotiation strategy on behalf of the EU.
Mm-hmm. Maria, some advisors, Trump's advisors, mentioned that they talk about changing borders in Ukraine. How could this affect other conflicts in the world?
Profoundly. Our whole system is actually based on the sanctity of borders, because the last time that we did not protect our borders, we have not taken our borders seriously, we ended up with a world war. One of the reasons why it is so important for all of us to protect Ukraine, to be on Ukraine's side in this war, is simply because for what Ukraine stands for, which is the rules-based world. If we allow that rule to be set aside, then we just open the gateways for everything else. Every revisionist power in the world, and we're actually neighbors to one of them, would actually try to do exactly the same. So if you just change the names in the countries and you replace them with us and those who are close to us, you would realize immediately the impact of that effort, of that attempt, and also you would recognize the reasons why we are really so firm, and we must remain firm in keeping up the rules. Otherwise the whole system would simply collapse around us. And we're not strong enough to fight for it. Up to now, we're too used to peace and security and prosperity to have the stomach for this kind of fight. And let me remind you, and apologies for being blunt, but we're not used to dead people arriving on our shores, especially not our sons.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Maria. Let's go to Johannesburg to listen to Elizabeth's take on this, about territorial adjustment in Ukraine and how this could affect other conflicts around the world, Elizabeth.
Well, I would agree largely with what Maria has set out. I think the issue of inviolability of borders is a bedrock, and once that goes, then everything goes. Of course, if we just reflect back to the African context, after decolonization, one of the first decisions that the Organization of African Unity took was to recognize the borders, the colonial borders. And in the period since, there have been, I think, two exceptions. The one is Eritrea, where the two parties came to an agreement, Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the other one was Sudan, where again, the two parties through the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005 agreed that there would be a referendum in 2011, and South Sudan was able to secede. Of course, the position that many, and this is interesting, the position that many African countries have taken with regard to Ukraine would perhaps sort of seem to be to stand in opposition to something like that. They have adopted a non-aligned position, seeing this conflict as really a proxy. And I know this is problematic for European audiences, that this is a proxy that, in effect, in many ways, NATO and the West sort of created the groundwork for and allowed, in a sense, Russia to do what it did. I'm not of that view, but it's important to understand that narrative as well. Many African countries, my own included, have really, since then, I think, pushed for the importance of seeking a diplomatic settlement. And perhaps in that way, there will be some agreement and potential area of convergence with the incoming Trump administration. And that clearly what is important is to make sure that both parties are at the table. That's always the position that South Africa takes. Of course, the thing that we have to factor in is that not all parties, unlike in African conflicts where South Africa has mediated in many over the last 30 years, you have here an asymmetrical power arrangement between an aggressor that is infinitely more powerful and a country that clearly has been the victim. But we all know that this will have to end in some sort of diplomatic settlement, and diplomatic settlements require compromises. Now, whether that ends up in a de jure or de facto change in borders, we don't know. But it is this sets a precedent, and but it's not the first precedent. We just need to think about Georgia in 2008, where you have a frozen conflict and, in effect, a de facto change in boundaries. So this has been with us for some time, and I fear we're not currently in a position to push the slide away back to where we might have been, say, 30 years ago.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Bryce, I need a quick, if you can, answer on the relation between China and Russia under the Trump administration. And do you think there is an assessment that there might be a risk under the new Trump era that we might return to a system where Russia influences security in Europe? Do you agree with this assessment? A quick, if you can.
So yes, I agree with the last part of that. I will say this, though. I don't believe in what's become known as the dragon bear hypothesis, that these two countries are now so joined at the hip that we have to consider them almost as a sort of strategic unity. I think that Russia feels some discomfort being the junior partner to China when historically it's been the other way around. And that means that not in the next 5 years, probably not in the next 10 years, but at some stage there may well be opportunities to bring Russia back into the fold, particularly if we are looking at, it sounds horrible now and it probably doesn't sell in a European audience, but a sort of reverse situation that we had in the Cold War, where we, the West, courted China so as to counterbalance the Soviet Union. Going forward, that may actually be a possibility a long time into the future, because I think Russia feels very, very nervous about its position vis-a-vis China. And I think we can make use of that probably in a post-Putin era. In the meantime, I think actually, I think to a certain extent, Trump does have the ability to talk to Putin in a way that Biden did not. He has got that relationship. Now, whether that means that Putin will have an influence of Trump, or that Trump can actually push Putin into a negotiated settlement that we can all live with, I'm not sure. I'm not terribly sure, I'm afraid.
Mr. Dokos, do you see any changes in the United States policy towards southeastern Europe and the relation between Greece, Turkey, and the United States?
A quick comment, if I may, about borders, because borders is something very important in international affairs. And, for example, Africa is still suffering from the artificial borders that were drawn back more than a century ago. And if there is, I fully agree with Maria, if there is such a change, there are two countries in this panel, Greece and Taiwan, that would be very alarmed. What I'm worried about is apprentice sorcerers who might look at the map and say, well, if I draw a line here and another there, I solve the problem. Hopefully it won't happen. Now, Southeastern Europe, Western Balkans, I think the main game changer here is EU enlargement. So that's up to the Europeans to make that decision. Eastern Mediterranean, first impression, the appointments are good. Knowledgeable people, moderate politicians, we'll see. But then, three quick comments. First of all, Turkey, I think its unpredictability and flexible foreign policy is a great asset. Unpredictability and flexible foreign policy can be a major weakness vis-à-vis a Trump administration. There is a saying, if you walk at the middle of the street, you may get hit by cars going both directions. So, walking that fine line can sometimes be very, very difficult. Second point, Turkey and Israel. Anyone launching those vitriolic attacks against Israel will have a hard time in Washington, whatever the administration is. Of course, President Erdogan is known for making these 180 degrees turns, but we'll see. Final point, you have a successful partnership, U.S. with Greece, Cyprus, who are working very well with Egypt and Israel and the Gulf states and all the way to India. And you have facilities like Suda Bay and Alexandroupolis. If I was based in Washington, a policymaker there, I wouldn't change a successful partnership.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Dokos, Maria, Bryce, Anne, and Elizabeth in Johannesburg, and the audience for the participation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.